It was a warm June morning in northern Nevada, the kind of day when the desert seemed to glow with quiet beauty. The sun had just begun to climb over the rocky ridges, spreading a golden light across miles of open land. The air smelled faintly of sagebrush and dust, and a gentle breeze carried the sound of distant cattle bells. For Earl Donovan, this was the most peaceful time of day. Before the heat rolled in and the world woke up, the land felt alive in its own quiet way. Earl had lived on his ranch for most of his life. He was a man in his late 50s, tall, weathered, and patient, the kind of person who didn't say much but noticed everything. He'd inherited the land from his father and kept it running through hard years and dry seasons. His ranch sat between the edge of the Carson Range and miles of desert plain. The nearest town was a half-hour drive away, and the nearest neighbor even farther. Most days Earl didn't mind the solitude. He liked the open space, the rhythm of chores, and the honest work that came with caring for animals and the land. That morning, Earl saddled up his horse, Dusty, a calm old gelding with a pale coat and steady step. Together they began their daily ride along the fence line, a habit Earl kept to check for breaks, strays, or anything out of place. He rode with a slow, easy posture, one hand resting on the saddle horn and the other loosely holding the reins. The desert stretched wide and endless before him, painted with shades of red and gold. Small bursts of green brush dotted the land, and a few hawks circled lazily in the sky. As he rode, Earl's mind wandered the way it often did on long rides. He thought about how the world seemed to change faster every year. New machines, new people moving in, old traditions fading away, but out here time still moved slowly. The ranch hadn't changed much since his father's day, and that gave him comfort. He liked things that stayed simple, good weather, healthy animals, and a job done right. After an hour or so, he reached the far edge of his property, near an old mining outpost that had been abandoned for decades. The wooden structure stood crooked against the horizon, its boards gray from the sun and wind. Earl had passed it countless times and never paid much attention to it anymore. But this morning something caught his eye, a glint of white near the outpost, faint but clear against the dark ground. At first, he thought it might be trash, maybe a tarp or a piece of fabric carried by the wind. Still, something about it didn't sit right with him. Earl wasn't the type to ignore small details. He nudged Dusty's side gently, guiding the horse toward the old building. The closer he got, the more he could make out. It wasn't trash. It looked like a piece of clothing and maybe a dress or a shirt, tangled on something tall. Earl's brow furrowed. The area around the outpost was fenced off years ago to keep cattle from wandering too close. Hardly anyone came out here. His curiosity sharpened. He slowed Dusty as they approached, scanning the ground for tracks or signs of movement. The wind whispered through the dry brush, and for a moment everything felt strangely still. Even the usual hum of insects seemed quieter. When he reached the clearing, he stopped. The wooden post that once held a miner's pulley now stood alone, leaning slightly to one side. The piece of white cloth fluttered from it, catching the sunlight. Earl dismounted and walked closer, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. The cloth turned out to be part of a light dress, small, delicate, and torn at one edge. There was something tied around the post, too, a bit of rope worn and frayed. It looked like someone had used it recently. Earl's chest tightened with a quiet unease. He looked around carefully, his eyes sweeping over the surrounding land. There were footprints in the dust, and faint but fresh. Small footprints like those of a child or young person. His heart began to beat faster, not from fear, but from a rising concern he couldn't explain. This wasn't something he expected to find on a normal morning. He took off his hat and wiped his brow. The air felt heavier now. He listened, really listened, but all he heard was the whisper of the wind against the rocks. He called out softly, "Hello? Anyone out here?" His voice echoed faintly across the empty land. No answer came back. He waited a moment, then turned toward the outpost. Maybe someone had taken shelter inside. The door hung half open, creaking with each push of the wind. Earl stepped closer and peeked in. The small room was empty except for old mining tools, scraps of wood, and the smell of dust and age. No signs of life. But just as he was about to step back outside, something shiny on the ground near the door caught his eye. It was a small silver medallion, half covered by dust. He bent down and picked it up carefully. The metal was warm from the sun, and when he brushed off the dirt, he saw an engraving on it. a design of a hawk flying over a mountain. On the back, tiny letters spelled out something he couldn't quite read without his glasses. But one thing was clear, it wasn't old. The medallion still had a clean shine, meaning someone had dropped it not long ago. Earl stood there for a moment, holding the medallion in his rough hand. He felt an odd sense of connection, as if this small object carried a story he didn't yet understand. He looked back toward the post and the dress fluttering in the wind, then back at the medallion. A part of him wanted to ride home and call the sheriff right away. Another part told him to look a little longer, to make sure no one nearby needed help. He stepped around the side of the outpost and scanned the horizon again. The desert stretched endlessly, but now it didn't feel as peaceful as before. It felt watchful, as if the land itself was waiting for him to notice something else. He thought he heard a faint sound in the distance, almost like a soft cry carried by the wind. He turned his head quickly, straining to listen, but the sound faded just as fast as it came. Probably the wind, he muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure he believed it. He looked down at the medallion again. The design bothered him somehow. It felt familiar, like he'd seen it years ago, maybe on a sign or an old pamphlet. But the memory stayed just out of reach. Earl put the medallion carefully into his pocket and walked back to his horse. He paused one last time to look at the old post and the bit of fabric still hanging there. The scene felt strange. Too deliberate to be an accident, but too quiet to make sense. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't been long ago. He could feel it in the air. As he rode back toward the ranch house, the morning no longer felt calm. The landscape that once looked open and peaceful now seemed filled with questions. The sun climbed higher, throwing long shadows across the ground. Earl couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something meant to stay hidden. When he reached his home, he unsaddled Dusty and sat on the porch with a glass of water, the medallion still in his hand. He turned it over again and again, trying to recall where he had seen that emblem. His mind went back to a time years earlier, when a group had come through town promoting a new rehabilitation ranch for troubled youth. They had used a symbol, a hawk over a mountain, on their brochures. Could it be the same one? He frowned, uncertain but uneasy. That program had disappeared after a few years, and no one really talked about why. He had brushed it off back then, but now he wondered. If the medallion came from that place, what did that mean? And what was someone doing out there by the old mine? The day wore on, and Earl couldn't get the questions out of his head. He decided to call the sheriff's office in town to report what he found. The torn fabric, the rope, and the medallion. It might be nothing, but his instincts told him it was something worth checking. He wasn't the kind of man to ignore a feeling like that. Before he made the call, he took one last look at the medallion resting on his table. The silver caught the afternoon light, flashing softly like a mirror. Earl didn't know it yet, but that small object was the first piece of a story that would soon reach far beyond his quiet ranch. A story that would uncover secrets hidden for years, and test the strength of one man's sense of right and wrong. As the sun began to dip again behind the mountains, Earl stepped outside and looked toward the west. The land was still calm and beautiful again, but now he saw it differently. Somewhere out there, someone had left behind a message, even if they hadn't meant to, and somehow it had found its way to him. The morning after his strange discovery, Earl Donovan woke earlier than usual. The sun had barely touched the horizon when he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, staring at the small silver medallion resting on the kitchen table. It caught the dim light, reflecting tiny sparkles across the worn wooden surface. He hadn't slept well that night. His thoughts kept circling back to the old outpost, the torn piece of fabric, the rope, the footprints in the dust, and that medallion. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it shining in his hand like it was asking to be noticed. Earl wasn't a man who believed in coincidences. Out here in the desert, things happened for a reason. Storms rolled in, animals strayed, fences broke, and every change had a cause. Something about that place yesterday had felt deeply wrong, even though he couldn't explain why. After finishing his coffee, he called the county sheriff's office. The line clicked and crackled before a familiar voice answered. "Morning, Earl. What's got you up this early?" It was Sheriff Tom Harlan, a steady, good-natured man Earl had known for years. "Tom," Earl began, trying to sound calm, "I found something odd out near the old mining post yesterday. Thought it best to let you know." He explained what he'd seen, the white cloth, the old rope, and the small silver medallion he'd picked up. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Didn't think anyone went near that place anymore, Tom said slowly. You sure about the footprints? Fresh as this morning, Earl replied. Small, too. Like a kid's, another pause. Then, all right, I'll drive out there and take a look. You still got that medallion? Right here on my table. Bring it along, Tom said. Meet me by the west gate around 9. Earl hung up and felt a quiet sense of relief. He wasn't imagining things, at least. Someone else would see what he'd seen. He grabbed his hat, slipped the medallion into his shirt pocket, and headed out. By the time he reached the west gate, the sun was bright, and the heat was already building. Sheriff Tom's pickup truck was parked by the fence, dust settling behind its tires. Tom stepped out tall and broad-shouldered, wearing his tan uniform and a serious expression. Morning, he greeted. Show me where you found it. Earl led the way on horseback while Tom followed in the truck along the dirt trail. It didn't take long to reach the outpost. Everything looked the same as yesterday, except now the sunlight made every detail sharper. The dry boards, the post standing alone, and that bit of white fabric still fluttering faintly in the breeze. Tom got out of the truck, putting on his gloves as he looked around. You aren't kidding, he murmured. He crouched near the post, studying the rope. That's not old, he said after a moment. Weather hasn't even touched it yet. Earl nodded. And these? He pointed toward the faint footprints still visible in the dust. Tom bent down to inspect them. Small steps, he said softly. Looks like someone might have stumbled a bit. You see anyone around? No one, Earl said. But I thought I heard something. Maybe the wind, maybe not. Tom straightened up, shading his eyes with one hand as he scanned the horizon. The land stretched empty for miles, but emptiness could be deceiving. You could stand 100 feet away out here and disappear behind the brush. What about that medallion? Tom asked. Earl reached into his pocket and handed it over. The sheriff turned it over in his palm, frowning. That's some kind of emblem, he said, brushing the dirt off the front. Hawk over a mountain. Doesn't look like jewelry you'd find in a store. He flipped it over, reading the tiny letters on the back. Silver Creek Home. Earl's heart gave a small jolt. He recognized the name now. That old program he'd heard about years ago. You remember them? He asked. Tom nodded. Yeah. Closed down after some sort of investigation, if I recall right. Never heard much else after that. Why would something from there turn up out here? That's what's bothering me, Earl said quietly. Tom slipped the medallion into a small evidence bag he carried in his truck. I'll take this back to town, see what I can dig up. You mind if I look around a bit? Go ahead, Earl said. Tom spent the next hour checking the area, walking slow circles around the outpost. He took a few photos, measured the footprints, and collected a piece of the rope. Earl watched from a distance, the dry wind tugging at his hat brim. The longer he stood there, the more uneasy he felt. Something about this place seemed too quiet, as if it was holding its breath. Finally, Tom returned to the truck. I'll have one of my deputies come out here later to look again. You did the right thing calling me, Earl. Earl nodded, but the sheriff could tell he was still troubled. You all right? Yeah, Earl said, though his voice was heavy. Just feels like I walked into someone else's story. A story I don't understand yet. Tom gave him a small, reassuring nod. We'll figure it out. They parted ways, Tom heading back to town and Earl returning to his ranch. But even as the day went on, Earl couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't finished. He went about his chores, feeding the horses, mending a section of fence, yet his thoughts stayed fixed on the outpost. He kept seeing the medallion in his mind and hearing that faint sound he'd thought was the wind. By late afternoon, the sky began to shift colors, soft orange melting into rose. Earl sat on his porch, listening to the desert's quiet hum. Then he noticed something unusual, a set of tire tracks near the old dirt road leading out to the range. They weren't his, and they weren't from Tom's truck either. They looked fresh. He walked over and crouched down to study them. The prints were narrow, maybe from a small car or van, and they came from the direction of the highway, stopping just past his gate and turning back the same way. Whoever had been there hadn't stayed long. Earl stood up slowly, looking out across the land. He couldn't see any dust clouds or movement, but the feeling of being watched crept into him again. Maybe he was overthinking. Maybe it was just travelers who'd gotten lost, but his instincts told him something else. That night, long after the sky went dark and the stars filled the desert, Earl sat awake with a lantern on the table. He kept thinking about the girl who might have left those footprints. Who was she? Why was she out there? And what did that medallion mean to her? Around midnight, the phone rang, breaking the silence. It was Sheriff Tom again. "Earl, you still awake?" "Barely," Earl said, straightening up. "What's going on?" Tom's voice had a tense edge now. "You might want to hear this. That place on the Medallion, Silver Creek home, it wasn't just a small program. It was part of a bigger network that handled missing kids run by some private group. They shut down after several reports about how people disappeared from there. Nothing ever proven, but..." Earl rubbed his temples. "You think it's connected?" "I don't know yet," Tom replied. "But I'll tell you this. The FBI kept their files sealed for years. Someone out there didn't want that name coming up again." Earl's stomach tightened. He thought of the old post, the footprints, the rope. "So what happens now?" "I'm going to send in a team to search that area again tomorrow morning," Tom said. "Stay close to home tonight, Earl. And if you see anything unusual, lights, cars, people, call me right away." "All right," Earl said softly. "Be careful, Tom." After hanging up, Earl walked to the window. The desert outside was calm and silent, but it no longer felt peaceful. The land that once felt like a friend now seemed like it was keeping secrets. The moonlight glowed faintly over the range, touching the ground where the old mine lay on a pale, distant shimmer. He stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of something bigger than himself settling over the night. The medallion was gone now, locked away at the sheriff's office, but its image stayed burned in his mind. A hawk over a mountain, a symbol that once meant nothing, now felt like a key to a door that should have never been opened. He didn't know it yet, but the next morning would change everything. What they would find near that abandoned outpost would bring more questions than answers, and pull him deeper into a mystery that would reach far beyond his quiet ranch life. For now, he could only wait. The next morning came quietly, with the sky painted in soft shades of pink and gold. The desert air felt cool before the sun began to warm the land. Earl Donovan stood on his porch with a cup of coffee, staring out toward the distant hills. Everything looked peaceful again, but he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. He hadn't slept much that night. Every sound, the rustle of the wind, the creak of the old barn door, made him sit up and listen. He had kept a flashlight by the window, half expecting to see headlights coming down the road, but the night stayed calm. Too calm, maybe. Now, as the first light touched the horizon, a dust cloud appeared in the distance. A few minutes later, 2 sheriff's trucks rolled up to his gate. Sheriff Tom Harlan stepped out, followed by 2 deputies. They nodded to Earl and gathered their gear. "Morning, Earl," Tom said. "We're heading back to that outpost. Got a team from Reno meeting us there in an hour." Earl nodded. "You think you'll find something?" Tom looked toward the hills. "I'm not sure what we'll find, but I can tell you this, that medallion you found, it got the attention of people higher up. Someone recognized the name engraved on it." Earl frowned. "From Silver Creek home?" Tom nodded slowly. "Yeah. One of the agents in Reno said it was a place for youth rehabilitation, sort of a boarding facility. But there were reports of people being taken there against their will. Some were never seen again." Earl felt a chill run down his spine. "You're saying that little medallion came from one of them?" Tom didn't answer right away. "Maybe," he said finally. "We're going to find out." Earl offered to guide them back to the outpost. He saddled up Dusty while the sheriff's convoy followed the trail behind him. The morning sun grew stronger, lighting up the desert with a warm golden glow, but the closer they got to the old mine, the heavier the air felt. Even the sound of the engines seemed distant, like the land itself was holding its breath again. When they arrived, the deputies began setting up markers and taking pictures. The rope, the footprints, and the piece of fabric were still there, untouched just as Earl had seen them. A few yards away, one of the deputies pointed to something half buried near a rock. "Sheriff, over here." Tom walked over, crouched down, and brushed away the dust. It was a small shoe, dusty but intact, and a child's shoe. Earl stood beside him, feeling his throat tighten. "Looks recent," Tom said quietly. "Maybe a week or 2 old." The deputies began widening the search area, moving carefully around the outpost. Earl stood off to the side watching, his hat pulled low against the sun. He couldn't stop thinking about that little shoe. It was such a small thing, yet it made everything suddenly feel real. Not just strange or mysterious, but real. Someone had been here. Someone young, scared, and alone. After a while, one of the Reno investigators arrived, Agent Claire Morrison, a woman in her 40s with calm eyes and a firm, focused tone. She shook Earl's hand and thanked him for calling the sheriff. "You might not realize it," she told him, "but what you found could help us with several open cases. This emblem," she showed him a printed image of the same hawk and mountain design, "matches a mark found in 2 other locations across state lines. We think it's connected to a group that used to operate under the Silver Creek name." Earl frowned. "What kind of group?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Officially, it was a rehabilitation center, but records suggest it was something different. We believe it moved from state to state after it closed down, always under new names but using the same symbol. Until now, we didn't know it ever reached Nevada." Earl looked out at the endless desert and shook his head. "And all this time nobody knew they were here?" "Not until now," she said softly. "They spent the rest of the morning searching the area. At one point, a deputy called out that he'd found something near a dry creek bed about 50 yards away. It was a small metal tag, shaped like a coin with the number 42 engraved on it." Earl watched as the agents carefully placed it in a small evidence bag. Tom walked back over to him. "You see that?" Earl nodded. "Looks like some kind of ID tag." "Yeah," Tom said. "But the agent says the number matches their old files. They had numbered bracelets for the kids at that home. This might have belonged to one of them." Earl stared at the horizon where the land stretched forever. "That poor kid," he said quietly. "Whoever they were." Agent Morrison returned later with a notebook in hand. "We're going to take some of these items to Reno for analysis," she explained. "If you don't mind, we'd like to ask you a few more questions about what you saw yesterday." Earl told her everything. The way the fabric moved in the wind, the rope on the post, the footprints in the dust, and the faint sound he thought he'd heard. She listened carefully, jotting down notes, her expression calm but serious. When he mentioned the sound, her eyes lifted. "You said it sounded like someone calling out?" "Maybe," Earl said. "It was faint, could have been the wind. But it felt human." She nodded slowly. "We'll keep that in mind." By early afternoon, the search wrapped up. The trucks pulled away one by one, leaving behind only tire marks and the quiet hum of the desert again. Earl stayed behind with Sheriff Tom for a few minutes. "Tom," he said, "you really think this is connected to something bigger?" The sheriff looked down at the ground, his hat shading his eyes. "I've been in this job a long time, Earl," he said quietly. "I've learned that when something feels wrong out here, it usually is, and this feels like the start of something we haven't seen the end of." Earl nodded, his stomach sinking. When he got back home, the day felt unusually long. The ranch chores gave him something to do, but his thoughts never left that outpost. The image of the shoe, the tag, and the medallion replayed in his mind like pieces of a puzzle he didn't know how to fit together. That evening, he turned on the small radio he kept in his kitchen. A local news station was reporting that the sheriff's office had found evidence of possible illegal activity near an old mining site, and that federal investigators were involved. The reporter didn't mention names, but Earl knew exactly what they were talking about. A few minutes later, his phone rang again. It was Sheriff Tom. "Earl," Tom said, "I thought you should know. The medallion you found had fingerprints on it. They belonged to a girl who was reported missing 6 months ago in Utah. Her name's Clara Jennings. She was last seen wearing a necklace with a silver charm. Same hawk and mountain symbol." Earl's heart sank. 6 months, he whispered. "You think she's still alive?" Tom paused. "We don't know, but the fact that the prints were fresh gives us hope." Earl gripped the phone tighter. "What happens now?" "The FBI's sending out more agents tomorrow. They'll comb every inch of that area. If the girl's out there, we'll find her." When Earl hung up, he sat in silence. Outside, the desert was bathed in twilight, that quiet moment between day and night when everything turns golden and still. The same land he'd loved all his life now felt heavy with secrets. He stepped outside and looked toward the direction of the old mine. The mountains stood dark and quiet in the distance, and the wind carried a soft, almost musical sound through the brush. For a brief second, he thought he heard something again, faint, far away, like a whisper calling his name. He closed his eyes, listening harder, but the sound faded. Maybe it was just the wind again, or maybe not. As he stood there, he realized that this was no longer just about a strange discovery on his land. It was about something much deeper, a thread that connected his quiet world to a story that had been hidden in plain sight. The silver medallion had opened a door, and what lay beyond it was something none of them could yet understand. And deep down, Earl knew, this wasn't over. The medallion had brought the law to his doorstep, but it had also stirred something else in the desert. Something waiting to be found. The next morning, the desert felt different. The air carried a quiet tension, like the land itself knew something important was about to happen. Earl Donovan woke before sunrise again. He moved slowly, his body tired but his mind wide awake. The sound of the wind outside reminded him of the night before, how he thought he'd heard a faint voice carried through the desert air. He couldn't forget it. Maybe it had been his imagination, or maybe it was real. Either way, it kept him uneasy. After a quick breakfast, he drove out to meet Sheriff Tom and the team of agents who had returned for a second search. The convoy of trucks rolled down the dirt road, raising long trails of dust behind them. The early light turned the sky pink and orange, and the empty land seemed endless in every direction. When Earl arrived at the old mining outpost, he saw that the place looked busier than ever. Yellow tape surrounded the area, and agents moved carefully with equipment, marking spots and taking photos. Sheriff Tom waved him over. "Morning, Earl," he said, adjusting his hat. "We've got a lot more eyes out here today. The team from Utah came in overnight. Turns out that girl, Clara Jennings, was reported missing not too far from the old Silver Creek property." Earl nodded slowly. "You think she made it all the way here?" Tom sighed. "It's possible. If that medallion was hers, she could have been brought through this area somehow." Earl felt his chest tighten. The thought of a young girl lost out here in the middle of nowhere weighed heavy on him. The desert could be harsh even for grown men. For a child, it would be nearly impossible to survive alone. One of the agents, Claire Morrison, approached them with a folder in her hands. "Mr. Donovan," she said politely, "thank you again for cooperating. We've made some progress." She opened the folder to show him a photograph. It was the same medallion he'd found, but now cleaned and shining under bright light. The fingerprints matched Clara's, but there's something else. Inside the edge of the charm, there was a small engraving, initials, SCH-21. That's a code for one of the older Silver Creek home groups that operated near Utah back in 2012. Earl frowned. "Older group?" "Yes," she explained. "The organization that ran Silver Creek didn't disappear completely when it closed. It split into smaller operations, youth programs, private retreats, and shelters. But the records show that some of those programs weren't properly licensed. They moved around a lot using new names. And the same emblem, that hawk and mountain, kept showing up." Sheriff Tom crossed his arms. "You're saying this might be part of something that's still going on?" Agent Morrison nodded. "It's possible. We found signs that some of the people connected to Silver Creek still operate in small desert areas. Private lands, old ranches, abandoned buildings. Always quiet, always far from the public eye." Earl felt a chill as he looked toward the horizon. The Nevada desert was full of such places. Empty spaces where people could hide for years without being found. He'd always thought of it as peaceful land, but now it felt like something else entirely. The team spread out to search the nearby dry creek bed. Earl watched as one of the agents waved a metal detector slowly across the sand. A few minutes later, a sharp tone broke the silence. They all hurried over. The agent knelt and dug gently with a small shovel until something metallic appeared. It was another medallion, just like the first one, only more worn, its edges scratched and faded. Agent Morrison's eyes widened. "This one's older," she said. "Look, the same symbol but no engraving on the back. These weren't just personal items. They were identifiers." Earl's heart sank. "Identifiers? For what?" She looked at him carefully. "For groups, or possibly for individuals enrolled in those facilities. Every person had a number. The numbers were stamped onto their items. Necklaces, bracelets, sometimes even clothes. It helped the organization keep track of them." Earl stared at the medallion as the sunlight glinted off its surface. He thought about Clara, about that small shoe they'd found the day before, and how lonely she must have felt out here. "Sheriff," one of the deputies called out suddenly, "we've got something else." Everyone turned. The deputy held up a small tin box, half rusted but still intact. Inside were several folded papers, yellowed and brittle from time. Agent Morrison took them carefully and began to read. Her expression changed as her eyes scanned the page. "It's a list," she said softly. "Names, ages, and state initials. Tom stepped closer. How many names? She counted quietly, then looked up. About 30. Earl felt his stomach drop. 30? Most of these names are from Utah and Arizona, she said. Some were probably transferred from one site to another. And look here. She pointed at the bottom of the page. One of the entries says Relocation, Nevada. The word hung in the dry air like a shadow. Earl rubbed the back of his neck. You think this outpost was one of their sites? We can't be certain yet, Morrison replied. But it may have been used as a temporary stop. A place to move people between facilities. That would explain the signs of activity, the footprints, and the rope you found. Sheriff Tom frowned deeply. If that's the case, then someone's been using this land right under our noses. They decided to continue searching the nearby canyon before the day grew too hot. Earl rode ahead a little on his horse, scanning the landscape for anything unusual. He'd lived on this land all his life, and he could tell when something didn't belong. After a few minutes, he noticed tire marks cutting across a patch of sand near the canyon's edge. Faint but recent. He called out, and the team came over. The tracks led toward a narrow path between two ridges. At the end of the path stood a small structure, an old storage shed Earl hadn't seen in years. It was hidden behind a cluster of boulders almost invisible from the main trail. The door was slightly open, creaking as the wind brushed against it. Sheriff Tom and the agents moved in carefully, flashlights in hand. Inside they found a few empty crates, a blanket, and a rusted lantern. On one of the crates was a small notebook. Agent Morrison flipped it open, her brow furrowing. It's a journal, she said. Looks like notes from someone working here. The handwriting was messy but readable. The entries mentioned deliveries, arrivals, and something called Group 4, relocation. The last date in the notebook was from just 3 weeks. Tom exchanged a glance with Earl. 3 weeks? He repeated quietly. That means whoever was using this place might still be around, Agent Morrison said. Maybe even nearby. Earl felt his pulse quicken. The land was so wide, so empty. Someone could be out there right now, hiding just beyond sight. The team spent hours documenting the shed and gathering every clue they could find. By afternoon, the heat had become almost unbearable. Earl stood by his truck, watching the horizon shimmer in the distance. Mr. Donovan, Agent Morrison said as she walked over. You did more than you realize. If you hadn't found that medallion, this place might have stayed hidden forever. What we're uncovering could help solve multiple missing person cases. Earl looked at her, his voice low. I just did what anyone should do. But it doesn't sit right with me, thinking this land, my land, might have been used for something wrong. She gave a small, understanding nod. Sometimes good people find the truth in the most unexpected places. When the agents packed up to leave, Earl stayed behind a moment longer. He looked out over the wide desert, feeling both proud and sad. The quiet land that had always been his peace had now become part of a story that reached far beyond him. As the sun began to set, he mounted Dusty and rode slowly back toward the ranch. The orange light stretched long across the sand and the shadows grew deep. The desert was silent again, almost too silent. But as he turned one last time to look back at the old mine and the distant shed, he saw something glint in the fading sunlight, a faint flash of silver, half buried in the dust. He stopped, watching the light fade away. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe, just maybe, it was another piece of the story waiting to be found. The sun was just touching the mountains when Earl Donovan returned to his ranch. The land looked quiet again, painted in soft orange and pink light. The air was still warm from the long day, but the evening breeze carried a hint of coolness. The world seemed calm, yet Earl knew things had changed forever. The ranch had always been his place of peace, his safe corner of the world. But now he couldn't look at it the same way. Somewhere out there, across that wide desert, people had hidden things they didn't want others to find. It made him realize that even the most peaceful places can hold secrets. He unsaddled his horse, Dusty, and gave him a gentle pat on the neck. You've done good, boy, he murmured. The old horse flicked his tail, calm as ever, unaware of the weight pressing on his owner's mind. Earl went inside and poured himself a cup of coffee. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. He sat down at the table, staring out through the window toward the west. The stars were just beginning to appear. Small lights scattered across the deep blue sky. A soft knock broke the quiet. Earl stood up and opened the door. Sheriff Tom was there, his hat in his hands, dust still clinging to his boots. His face looked tired, but there was a spark of relief in his eyes. "Evening, Earl," he said. "Mind if I come in?" "Not at all," Earl replied, moving aside. Tom stepped in, glancing around the familiar old room. "You keeping all right?" Earl gave a small nod. "As good as I can be." "Any news?" Tom sat down across from him, resting his hat on the table. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We found something out there, near that canyon you showed us. About half a mile further in, there's a narrow trail leading to an old water tank. Underneath it, the agents found a small underground space. Looked like it had been used not long ago." Earl's heart thudded once hard. "Used for what?" Tom hesitated. "It looked like a place where someone might have stayed. There were blankets, food wrappers, and a few items that belonged to a young person. And," he paused for a moment, "we found a photograph." Earl leaned forward. "Of who?" "Of a girl," Tom said softly. "Dark hair, maybe 14 or 15. The agents confirmed, it's Clara Jennings." For a moment, neither man spoke. The sound of the clock ticking seemed louder than before. "She's alive?" Earl asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded. "She is weak but alive. The agents found her early this morning, a few miles from that hidden space. Looks like she'd been trying to find help. She's in the hospital now in Reno. They say she'll recover." Earl let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his cup. "Thank the Lord," he said softly. "I thought—" "Well, I didn't know what to think," Tom smiled faintly. "She asked about you, actually. The girl remembers seeing a man on a horse from far away near the outpost. Said she tried to call out but didn't have the strength." Earl looked down at the table, his eyes misting. "So that sound I heard, and it wasn't the wind after all." "No," Tom said gently. "It was her." They sat quietly for a while, the kind of silence that carries more meaning than words. Finally, Tom reached into his pocket and took out a small object wrapped in cloth. "The agents wanted me to return this to you," he said, setting it on the table. "It's the medallion you found." "They're done with it for now." Earl unwrapped the cloth slowly. The silver charm gleamed softly under the light, the hawk and mountain still shining clear. It looked simple, almost ordinary, yet it had carried a story that reached across states, across lives. "She said this belonged to her," Tom added. "Her grandmother gave it to her years ago. Someone at that place took it from her and used it as a kind of tag, but she never stopped thinking of it as hers. She told the nurses she prayed someone would find it." Earl stared at the medallion for a long time. It felt strange in his hands, light but full of meaning. He thought about how a small piece of silver could connect strangers, bring truth out of silence and change lives. "What'll happen now?" he asked quietly. Tom rubbed his chin. "The investigation's still going. They've already found connections between Silver Creek and a few other names. Looks like there was a whole network of hidden facilities, just like the agent said. The good news is, with the evidence we found here, they can finally start shutting them down for good." Earl nodded slowly. "So all this started with one medallion." Tom smiled faintly. "Sometimes the smallest things open the biggest doors." After the sheriff left, Earl stepped outside again. The night had grown cooler. The sky was full of stars now, so many that the horizon shimmered with light. The ranch was quiet. The only sounds the soft rustle of the breeze through the grass and the distant hoot of an owl. He walked out to the fence line, resting his hands on the rough wood. From there he could see the faint outline of the old mining hills far away, the place where it had all begun. It looked peaceful again under the moonlight, as if it had never held any secrets at all. But Earl knew better. The land remembered. The wind that moved through the brush, the dust that covered old paths. They carried the stories of everyone who had ever crossed them. Some stories were joyful, some painful, and some hidden until the right person came along to uncover them. He looked down at the medallion in his hand, the moonlight glinting off its surface. For a long moment he simply held it, feeling the cool metal against his skin. Then gently, he placed it on a nail post at the edge of his property, facing west, where the desert met the horizon. "This is where your story turned," he said softly, as if speaking to the night. "You're free now." In the weeks that followed, word spread quickly. The newspapers wrote about the case. Nevada rancher's discovery leads to major investigation. Reporters called, and television crews showed up at the edge of his property, but Earl refused interviews. He told Sheriff Tom, "I'm no hero. I just found what needed to be found." Still, people from nearby towns came by to shake his hand. Some brought letters thanking him for helping uncover the truth. And one afternoon, a woman arrived with a young girl walking slowly beside her, Clara Jennings. She looked much healthier now, her hair neatly brushed, her face bright with shy gratitude. Earl didn't know what to say at first, but Clara smiled and reached into her pocket. "I wanted to return this," she said softly, handing him the silver medallion. Earl shook his head. "It's yours, child," she smiled again. "It was found because of you. I think it belongs to both of us now." Earl's eyes softened. He nodded and carefully closed her hand around the medallion. "Then keep it," he said kindly. "Let it remind you that even in the loneliest places, someone's always watching out." Clara's mother thanked him through tears, and as they drove away, Earl stood on his porch watching the truck disappear down the dirt road. The wind picked up slightly, moving through the dry grass like a whisper. The world was quiet again, but it was a better kind of quiet this time. That evening, as the sun went down, Earl sat on his porch with Dusty grazing nearby. He looked toward the horizon where the desert met the sky. The same land that had once felt heavy now seemed lighter, as if the truth had lifted a weight from it. He thought about how strange life could be, how one morning of routine could turn into something that changes everything. He hadn't set out to be part of a mystery or an investigation. He had only followed a feeling, a sense that something wasn't right. And that small act of paying attention had made all the difference. The stars came out brighter that night, stretching across the open sky like 1,000 silver medallions scattered by the wind. Earl leaned back in his chair, feeling the desert breathe around him. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace again. The land was quiet, the truth was known, and somewhere out there, a young girl was safe, because he had listened to a whisper that the world almost missed. And in that quiet moment, under the endless Nevada sky, Earl Donovan finally understood. Sometimes it takes just one ordinary person, in an ordinary place, to uncover something extraordinary.